Yes, my shit right here. So that's my shit right here. Welcome back to another episode of Road to William. Today's video, we're talking about John Henrik Clarke. I don't know much about this man, but that's why we're here on this road, on this journey. We're learning about new people, new things, to better ourselves, better our minds, to move forward in this world. Let's get it popping. They named him John Henry Clarke, and he later altered the spelling of his middle and last names to reflect his chosen identities and values. My daddy wanted me to be a farmer, feel the smoothness of Alabama clay, and become one of the first Blacks in my town to own land. But I was worried about my history being caked with that Southern clay. And I subscribed to a different kind of teaching and learning in my bones and in my spirit. Clarke was a prominent figure during the Black Power movement, a professor of Africana Studies at Hunter College and Cornell University, and founder of the African Heritage Studies Association in 1969. He had been aware of this distortion since childhood. I saw no African people in the printed and illustrated Sunday school lessons. I began to suspect at this early age that someone had distorted the image of my people. My long search for the true history of African people the world over began. Dr. Clarke's special relationship with African people afforded him the company of kings, queens, presidents, and other heads of state. So we're gonna watch a few clips of him. Y'all ready? Let's go. Come on, get your snacks. We're about to head on the road.
Wanted to know what the discussion was to be, it was about. He says, "Oh my God, you mean they're still discussing this stuff?" I said, "Yeah, of course they're still discussing this stuff because this stuff is the stuff that scholarship is made of and that academic inquiry is made of. Tonight we enter the world of scholars who have diametrically opposing views on the subject of the origins and foundations of what we know today as Western civilization. One school of thought is that it is distinctly African or Afro-Asian in origin. The other, that Western civilization in large measure is the bequest of ancient Greece. Make no mistake, this is not a mere difference of opinion in the ivory tower. The battle itself has become an allegory for something as important as the debate itself. Academic insurgents have breached the ramparts of the academy's high priesthood, and the battle is as much for the authority to write history and for how to write history. Our task tonight is to ferret out the truth insofar as we can discern it, but more importantly, to question and challenge. And we have four incredible people with us tonight, and I'd like to introduce them to you and have them come to the stage as they're introduced. Already on stage is Professor John Henrik Clarke. We're standing for you, Dr. Clarke. Teacher, historian, writer, lecturer, John Henrik Clarke is a unique resource and a special institution in the African world. Beginning in his early years, Dr. Clarke studied the world history of African people and became a master teacher. He has authored and or edited more than 30 books, short stories, and pamphlets on African and African American history, and is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of African World History in the Department of Africana and Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. Professor John Henrik Clarke. I'd like to ask to the stage Dr. Martin Bernal. Martin Bernal has been a professor of government at Cornell University since 1972 and an adjunct professor of Near Eastern Studies, also at Cornell since 1986. Educated at King's College, Cambridge.
I am not here to debate with anyone. I have devoted all of my adult life to this subject. I only debate with my equals. All others I teach. Broadly speaking, honestly speaking, the book, Not Out of Africa, a good sophomore effort, is not really about Not Out of Africa. Last year, it was the bell curve. This year, it's Not Out of Africa. Next year, it'll be something else. This is part of a world war against the role of African people in the history of the world. If we began history, began mankind, how is it that the last branch of the human race to enter that arena, marked civilization, now think they brought civilization? It is part of a war over and above Professor Lesterwitz's book and over and above her political naivete. Her naivete is about what is happening in the Western world. There was a recent book called The Tribe. It diagrammed every people, major people on the earth, searching for a piece of turf for themselves. It left out the African people because the other people, including Asian imperialists, have plans to take over Africa. There have been several articles in the New York Times advocating the recolonization of Africa. This book and other literature of this nature mean to prepare the world to accept a rationalization for the re-enslavement of Africa. And when you deal with the black endorsers of the book, running dogs of the new imperialism, professional white behind kissers, and as Carlos Cook used to say, a disgrace to the skin they wear. These people, if I be so kind to call them that, are running from themselves and teaching us a lesson that we should have learned long ago. Sometimes white wannabes are more dangerous than whites. And sometimes they'll fight you harder to be accepted by whites. They are running from their own people and running from definition. Now, what we need to look at now is how Professor Lesterwitz neglected the white writers through history, the radical European writers who wrote positively of Africa and who identified the relationship of Africa to the ancient Greeks. Now, if given time, and I probably won't be given it this evening, I can prove to you with your satisfaction, if you are listening, that Rome and Greece was not European creations. These were Mediterranean-inspired nations and couldn't be created by Europe because at the time there was no Europe. I came to this subject before I was 10 as a Baptist Sunday school teacher. I wanted to teach junior class in Sunday school, so I learned to read very early. What baffled me from the beginning was the Bible itself. I could not find my people in a book that's supposed to be about all mankind, and what called my attention to the neglect of Africa was the Sunday school lessons with all those white angels. And when they said God is love, God is kind, God is no respect of kin, I kept wondering, why didn't he let at least one or two little brown or black angels sneak into heaven? So I began to suggest that somebody else had tampered with God's book in favor of somebody else, and that the Bible, to a great extent, was a rationale for European domination, but had been used as such. Then, coming to, after leaving Georgia, after a white man that I've worked for, if he's alive today, he's a liberal with a capital L. His name was Gagsteiner. I asked him about some books on the African people in ancient history. And in the language of the South, he let me down slow. I mean, he spoke kindly. He said, you know, John, I'm sorry that you came from a race that's made no history. But if you persevere, if you obey laws and study hard, you make history someday, and you personally might one day be a great Negro like Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was the one thing whites approved of at that time. All right, while doing chores at a local high school, holding the coat and the books of a recitalist, I opened a book called The New Negro, and I found an essay by a Puerto Rican of African descent, Arthur Schomburg. The essay was called The Negro Digs Up His Past. Now I knew I was not only older than slavery, I was older than my oppressor, and my oppressor was the last branch of the human race to enter that arena. Mock civilization. Don't get mad, get smart, prove me wrong. Now, in the Old Harlem History Club, under Willis and Huggins, long since dead, John Jackson, died only a few years ago, and we had to take up a collection to bury him, Charles Cypher, J. Rogers, under all of these teachers pointing me to good material, and Arthur Schomburg telling me, go study the history of your masters. Study the people who took you out of history. Then you'll understand your history. I started on an old chestnut, recently mentioned, H.G. Wells' Outline of History. It is still worth reading. It is a good basic outline. His basic facts are in order. When he tell you about the Crusades, he's not off one iota. But his interpretation is basically Eurocentric to the point of being a prejudiced document. Now, I was reading these kinds of books. I was reading Spingarn's Decline of the West when I was 18 years old. So I began to read European masterpieces, and I began to read European Curiosity About Africa, Gerald Massey's 6th volume, Egypt, Life of the World, 2 volumes, Natural Genesis, 2 volumes, Book of the Beginning, 2 volumes. And I began to read Gerald Massey's attitude on religion and his idea that nearly European concepts of religion was stolen from outside of Europe. He was not a historian. He was not an Egyptologist. He was an agnostic, fighting the arrogance of the European of that day. See, the History Club led me to not only reading masterpieces by white radical writers who set the black radical writers in motion. A whole lot of claims blacks did not make until they saw the documents in works written by Europeans. And these works written by Europeans, what black had the time and the money to sit down and do a 6-volume work? I just wanted Professor Lestwich to know some basic information about the concept of Afrocentricity. There's a lot of people who believe in the African awakening and discovering of their history and their culture who do not accept the word Afrocentricity because it's a compromise with the word Africa. It's either African centricity or it's nothing. Right. And if she attacks Afrocentricity as the teacher of myth, have she attacked the nonsense about Columbus discovering America? Because he discovered absolutely nothing, and he committed an act of genocide. He set in motion an act of genocide 10 times worse than the act of genocide in Europe called the Holocaust, as though that was the only Holocaust in the world. That event Europe was wrong. And even if only 6 people were killed, it was wrong. But it was a matter started in Europe by Europeans that should have been solved in Europe by Europeans.
I'm sure that you're aware, as we are, that there is a spectrum of Afro and African-centric views. I'm a little bit curious what you think then of the work of Asante, who, as far as I know, does call himself an Afrocentrist. Are you saying that Professor Asante's work actually is flawed conceptually?
I'm saying that all work under the guise of Afrocentrist is not perfect, but it is an earnest effort to restore Africa to a proper commentary in human history. I think Professor Sanchez's work is written too fast, and there's some things he hadn't checked out as well as he need to. And I think too many times Afrocentricity becomes a personality cult, but that don't mean that I'm against African people discovering their history, their literature, their place in the political science of the world. That don't mean that I have not played a role in encouraging people to write about Africans in all the societies of the world. See, your talk keeps telling me what you have not read. You could not have been asking these questions about Afrocentricity if you have not read Anacalypsis, 2-volume dealing with the massive explosion of African people throughout the whole world. You could not possibly have read with any degree of understanding the 3 volumes, Africans in early Asia, Africans in early Europe, Africans in early America. We're not talking about no hearsay. We're talking about documents. Professor Joseph Harris's book dealing with the global dimensions of the African diaspora. I don't know. I mean, you keep telling me, you keep confessing your ignorance with your questions. You have not read. I'm telling you, before Afrocentricity, radical Europeans had pioneered in this work. Now, I haven't even mentioned the radical Black writers that you probably have not read. Now, if you read Chancellor Williams' chapter 2 in the book, Destruction of Black Civilization, read that chapter 2 called Egypt, Ethiopia's oldest daughter. And it deals with the Southern African origins of Egypt. If you read a book called Nubia, Corridor to Africa, once more you got the early Arab slave trade. I keep saying nobody came into Africa to do African people any good. After the Romans had disgraced themselves trying to be early Christians, the Africans thought that by accepting Islam, they could get the Romans off of their back. They were right. They did get the Romans off their back, but the Arabs replaced the Romans on their back, and the Arabs are still on their back.
This week and next, we will present Black Paper on White Racism. Frequently, the definition and effects of racism are greatly misunderstood. Certainly, the impact on Blacks can only be described by us. An operational definition of individual racism is subordination of a person or group because of race. But we will focus on the institutional practice of racism, when a group is subordinated by factors indirectly related to race. An example would be a union with all white members. You can only get in the union if a member sponsors you, and automatically whites select one another. So this pattern of selection automatically keeps Blacks out. The union is white in the first place because its membership reflects the leftover patterns of slavery. Therefore, racist behavior is both intentional and unintentional. Our institutions mostly involve unsuspecting individuals who are part of a racist pattern. All definitions of Black people's standards and values have been defined by whites in a society basically European. As simple as it may seem, we have never made any definition of our condition, beauty standards, social etiquette. Even our names have been given us by white culture. To make an authoritative statement of our concept of Christianity, history, education, values and culture, war, colonialism and imperialism, and psychological development, and how these institutions operate in a white racist society, 6 Black scholars and philosophers have been invited to present positions and analyses of these topics. With me tonight are John Henrik Clarke, an associate professor of African and Afro-American history at Hunter College in New York. Mr. Clarke is also author of 11 books, including Harlem, USA. Preston Wilcox, head of the Education Workshop of the Congress of African People, is president of Afram Associates, a Black educational consultant firm, and is an outstanding author. Reverend Albert Clegg is pastor of the Shrine of the Black Madonna in Detroit, Michigan, and an advocate of Black Christian nationalism. He is author of a soon-to-be-published book, Black Christian Nationalism, New Directions for the Black Church. Brother Clarke?
I'd like to begin by establishing some kind of a frame of reference. Exactly what are we talking about? And I think in order to do this, I'm going to try to dismiss the subject, then come back to it and deal with it. There is no such thing as a race. Nature created no races. Man created races, racial classifications, and he had his own reason for doing it. Now, who benefited from this artificial creation at first? Who benefits from it now? Now, let's look at the historical roots of this whole thing, and you're not going to understand it until you understand the implications, the far-reaching effects of the opening up of the so-called New World, Christopher Columbus and other thugs coming, suppressing the Indians, and finding a justification for this kind of thing. Let's look at Europe in the 15th and the 16th century, because racism has its roots in that second rise of Europe in the 15th and the 16th century. They had to justify what they were going to do to most of mankind. They were about to take over the whole world. Now, there's a myth about an argument about whether the world was round or flat. That's an old wise tale. The European had gained enough knowledge and had enough guns, and he had been hungry enough within the body of Europe until he decided that he was going to go out and take the world, be it round or flat. Now, in order to understand the religious basis of racism, we have to go back to a papal bull that the Pope issued in 1455 in an argument between Portugal and Spain. He turned to them impatiently and said, "You are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people." And it just so happens that most of the so-called infidels were non-European people, non-white people. Europe not only had its basis for racism, it had its basis for the slave trade, and this same basis would be good in the colonial system that followed. Racism was created to justify the slave trade, to justify the colonial system, and to justify the utter ruthlessness that had to go into the making of modern capitalism.
Brother Wilcox?
Let me begin by suggesting that the clearest evidence of racism in education is the essential control over Black education, both in so-called integrated settings and in segregated settings by white people, many of whom are incapable of responding to the people they're educating as people, many of whom are incapable of understanding the culture and the history of the people they're educating, many of whom really do not see any kind of responsibility for involving these communities in managing their own education. A second kind of aspect is the ability of white communities to keep Black people out of their communities and still yet exercise some influence over the education in Black communities. That is, even when there's no Blacks in the white community, whites are still having some kind of influence over the education in Black communities. A third example is the way in which our schools are organized. Despite the fact that we know we live in a racist society, the schools continue to be organized as though racism does not exist. That is, there's been no real shift of power within the school. There's been no effective change in the content. There's been no forthright recognition of the politics involved in education. For instance, in New York City, about 55% of the students are Black and Puerto Rican, yet we have one Black and one Puerto Rican member on a school board of 5 people. So 3 white people are making decisions that affect 55% of people whom they may not be able to respect as people.
Reverend Clay?
Well, I think the basic reason or symptom or proof for the racism of the Christian church is the simple fact that white people have pretended for so long that Jesus was white, and that they've had the necessity to interpret Jesus as being white, when essentially white Christianity is racially, is historically false and theologically absurd, and practically, in terms of its effect on Black people, it's a debasing institution that enslaves Black people. I think we have to understand, though, that we're not making moral judgments here. Any institution that exists in any society exists to serve the interests of the people who set it up. And Christianity began as a Black man's religion. It's an African religion. We have to remember that Israel went into Egypt with 70 people, and after approximately 750 years came out with over 2 million people, and hordes of other slaves who came out and became also a part of the emerging new nation of Israel. So Israel, the biblical Israel, was a Black nation, an African nation that came out of Africa and kept constant ties with Africa. And so we have to remember then that Jesus was a Black Messiah, not a white Messiah, and he comes out of the whole historical background of Africa, of African traditions, of African history, of African culture, the concept of communalism, the concept of the chosen people, the concept of kingdom of God on earth. All these things were out of African tradition, not out of the white man's tradition. And Jesus was essentially a revolutionary Messiah who was trying to lead a Black people in a revolt, in a struggle and conflict with a white Gentile oppressor. So the whole church has to be viewed from the point of view of the white oppressor. The white oppressor has one kind of Christianity, has one kind of church. The Black church has to become independent and go back to the historic African roots of Christianity, because the slave church that the white man set up for Black people tends to continue the enslavement of Black people. So the Black church has to become, again, a revolutionary instrument in the hands of Black people, controlled by Black people, fighting as Jesus fought for the liberation of Black people against white Gentile oppression.
I'd like to continue from Reverend Clarke's point and deal briefly with image, because image is the paramount factor in keeping racism alive. Now, exactly when did the Christian church become white? In as much as Christ is described in early literature as being swarthy and having hair like sheep's wool, and that's surely not a Caucasian's hair. The first image of the church, the first image of the Madonna was the Black Madonnas, and these Black Madonnas were very prevalent in the churches of Europe. Up until the 16th and the 17th century, there was no white Madonnas in the churches of Europe. And some of the churches of Europe to this very day have Black Madonnas. All right. At what point did Christianity become all white? And at what point did Christ become a blonde, blue-eyed person that hangs in your churches, and with a haircut and a uniform, he'd probably be a good Nazi? All right. One thing the Jews seem to have forgotten is that the picture of Christ, as in present-day literature, is an insult to them, because there's nothing particularly Jewish about him, physically or otherwise. All right. Now, another thing we're going to have to look at seriously is that when the Europeans projected themselves out into the broader world, they not only colonized most of mankind, they colonized the teaching of history itself. And gradually, so many things Black became white.
I'd like to just say one little word about when did Christianity become white. The process by which Christianity became gradually to be interpreted as being white began at a very early point with Apostle Paul, who wrote the epistles of the New Testament, and who was, even at that time, with Black Israel and Black Jews, an Uncle Tom Jew. He was an Uncle Tom Black Jew, and he wanted to identify with white Gentile world. He prided himself on being a Pharisee, but more on being having Roman citizenship. So as soon as he had sunstroke on the Damascus Road and said he's been converted, he started out to take the Christianity, the teachings of Jesus to the Gentile world. Now, he could not take the revolutionary teachings that Jesus had actually taught, because Jesus was a zealot, and they were engaged in revolution. I mean, open revolution. He was one of the zealot leaders at that time. So he couldn't take that to the Gentile world. So he had to make an image, a symbol out of Jesus on the cross, which was compatible with the heathen symbolism of the Roman and Greco-Roman heathen world. So he made Jesus a kind of a heathen symbol that he could take to the Gentile world. And the whole writings of the Apostle Paul tend then to destroy the basic African background of Christianity and to make it compatible with the Greco-Roman heathen world. So it began there. But the actual identification of Christianity as being a white religion didn't really take place until the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, when the pictures were being painted and paid for by the Catholic Church. At that point, white people had decided to declare black people inferior. And so the whole concept of Jesus being black, or the Madonna being black, was unacceptable to white people at all. A whole new type of slavery was beginning to emerge. The old type of slavery in Egypt, Joseph was a slave who rose to be second only to Pharaoh. A whole different concept of slavery. You were a slave only in the terms that your labor was taken. But gradually the white man declared that anyone who was non-white, who was enslaved, was declared to be inferior, therefore had a whole different kind of existence. So the whole gradual thing was a part of the slavery process that Dr. Clarke mentioned, a part of the betrayal of the Apostle Paul, and a part of the fall of Jerusalem and the fort, and when Jews were scattered all over the world. We have to remember one thing I think is very important, that the white Jews that we see today have no bloodline connection with the Jews of the biblical period. They were converted to Judaism in Europe and in Russia. They were converted and have no bloodline connection with the black Jews who make up the biblical Israel that the Bible writes about and of which Jesus was a part.
Well, what happened to the black Jews?
The black Jews are still in existence. They're black Jews in America. They're black Jews all over Africa. They're black Jews in Palestine. They're black Jews everywhere. Diane's daughter complained not more than 2 years ago that black Jews had moved on either side of her house, and therefore her property had depreciated in Palestine. Black Jews had depreciated her property. Jews had moved directly from Palestine to India, and the community celebrated its 1900th anniversary or something, and they had white Jews who had emigrated from Europe and black Jews who had originally come from Jerusalem at the fall of Jerusalem, had an uninterrupted straight line of connection from the fall of Jerusalem to India, all over the world.
It tended to make a whole lot of the people obsolete. Now, we keep worrying about the American promise and the American dream, and we forget it wasn't made to us. And the white man has not betrayed anything because he didn't promise us anything in the first place. Now, the role of institutions in a society is to reflect the power that controls that society. So we have American institutions arrayed against us. And we naively expect these institutions to reform themselves, because if they reform themselves, that's tantamount to presiding over their own demise.
I'd like to say one thing on that. I think the question you asked is how do the schools accomplish this? I mean, you were concerned about the process. I think we got to understand that there's no such thing as objective truth, which is implicit in everything Dr. Clarke says, that white people use the institutions to accomplish white purpose. The white purpose is to maintain a power position and keep everybody else in a subordinate, powerless kind of position. Now, that's the institution's purpose, and that's the way it functions and how it functions. And we got to realize then that everything that the schools teach is designed to fit into that purpose. The schools teach not objective truth, but what the white man wants to project as truth. Now, that's from the very kindergarten right straight on through.
For example, what?
Sociology. Sociology is not a science in the sense that it's dealing objectively with the way people live together. It's dealing with the white man's pattern of living together as the norm by which we judge how other people live. If you live like white people live, then you're living the way you are supposed to live. If not, you're either primitive or insane as a people. Psychologically, it's the same thing. Psychology does not deal with any objective kind of discussion or development of how people live or analysis of how people function as individuals. But how does the white
people have internal differences? And the European came in And the African naively...
Shout out to Afro Marxists.
First, I want to kind of give an account of myself for not being here next week, and to let you know that I won't be loafing because I don't even know how to loaf. In fact, I need a lesson in knowing how to rest, let alone loaf. I will be in Durham, North Carolina, delivering a lecture on a panel. This is the 20th anniversary of the publication of Hal Cruz's book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And I will deliver a paper on the crisis that Hal Cruz neglected. Because Hal Cruz wrote a very interesting book, a very personal book, but he did not deal with the real crisis of the Black intellectual. The real crisis of the Black intellectual started a long time ago and is still there. The crisis of not studying the intentions of other people toward us, the crisis of welcoming in future conquerors without knowing they are conquerors, the crisis of making bad alliances or no alliances at all, the crisis of letting other people come into his house and take down the good things about him, his religion, his culture, and sometimes his wife, and get away with it. We've been all too kind to people. Hal Cruz writes about the 20th century. I start at the 18th century, BC, and work straight up. We made a whole lot of mistakes in choosing friends and in choosing religions that were ours in the first place. People take the basis of religions from us, go away and dress them up and come back a few hundred years later and sell them to us as something new. We don't know it was ours in the first place. You should really read St. Augustine in his comments after the conference at Nicaea, when the Europeans took over Christianity and began to whiten it up. He said the whole thing made him laugh. These people are trying to give us a religion we had 3,000 years ago. And we had not only one crisis, we had many crises. I want to deal with the inability of a lot of African scholars to really deal in depth with the Hebrew entry in the Bible itself, a Jewish survival book, a book of wisdom. I'm not doubting that, but a book that the creators deserted because they dare not have the temperament to obey what's in the book. We might yet be the last humanitarians in the world because we were the first humanitarians in the world. We have a crisis around integration. We should have asked for justice. Let integration take care of itself. Had we asked for justice and been selective, we would not have integrated ourselves out of existence in so many different places. Many of the Black colleges are being taken over in the name of integration, especially the Black state schools. The Black state schools are being overrun with inept white teachers who can't teach any other place, and they go into Black schools and do no teaching and get paid for it. We misunderstood what it meant to be with them. We quite forget that some of us are far more competent than some of them, especially in some areas where we've been the masters in the field of teaching and in the fields of sciences, in the field of basic mechanics. I think this is a subject that needs to be dealt with because there's a reoccurring crisis. There's a crisis of ideology in our life. We're always choosing other people's ideologies and neglecting our own.
This is why Ghana is not the great example nation that it could have been, not the great beating heart of Africa that it could have been. Now, one thing our intellects have not learned, that nothing the European mind ever devised was meant to do anything but to facilitate European control over the world. The European wastes no time in humanity or sympathy. He wants to control, and he will control by any means necessary, or he will destroy. He shares nothing with nobody. He never enters into partnerships with other people. And if you think that he's going to enter into a partnership with you, no matter what he calls himself, capitalist, Marxist, or socialist, or anything, he came to control. Under any guise, he must control. And once you understand that, you have to understand, no matter what religion I belong to, no matter what denomination I belong to, no matter what political ideology I follow, my people must always be in charge of themselves. They must be the masters of themselves. And any ideology, any religion, anything that fails to serve that purpose is a waste of our time. All our energy needs to be converted into that. And this is the confusion of what we call our intellects. The role of the teacher, the intellect, the preacher, the role of any kind of leader is to make sure his people know the time of day, the political time of day, the emotional time of day, and the historical and cultural time of day. Make sure his people are trained in how to face reality. And if you face reality right now, you will realize that you are living in a society that is dying. The society is not only dying, the society intends for you to die with it. They'll take you down with it. And that you have within your own mind and within your own body the ability to make a whole new world. But you have to stop answering to stupid names like Negro and minority. You ain't no minority. There's only 2 people on the face of this earth that might have 1 billion people, the Chinese and us. When you count all of us, including those millions in the Pacific, millions throughout South America, the Caribbean islands, the United States, in Africa, we might have 1 billion people. Somebody say minorities. Answer to minorities every time somebody's gonna give away some money.
Like I said, I've never dived into learning about him. I'm glad I did. Still got more to learn. I'm gonna be reading his book, and I'll let y'all know how that is. Oh, let me see which one I picked up. Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise to European Capitalism. So that's what I'm going to be reading, tuning into. Just dropped another video. Keep watching, keep going, keep liking. Let me know how you felt about this video. I really like the part of them talking about the religion aspect of it and learning more in detail how it's affected people of today, how it's still affecting people today, and just unraveling all of that. I love that. We're still going to keep learning about people. Let me know in the comments if you want me to shed some light on somebody you know. But yeah, this is Dr. John Henrik Clarke. Go find out more about him. But this is going to wrap up today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Be safe. Peace. Yes, my shit right here. So I just smash it.